I never imagined a Tuesday morning could turn into a story I'd be telling years later. Normally, I'd roll over, curse the alarm, and stay in bed for at least another half hour. But something about that morning made me get up. Maybe it was instinct, or maybe it was just the kind of stubbornness that makes people who usually ignore gym routines suddenly drag themselves out the door. Either way, I left the apartment, grabbed my coffee, and stepped into the early city bustle. The streets were alive with movement. Bus doors squeaked, kids ran for school, and dogs yanked at their leashes like tiny tornadoes of energy. Steam rose from the subway vents, curling into the cold morning air. I sipped my coffee and let the caffeine lull me into a sense of ordinary calm, until the sound hit me. It wasn't loud, not exactly, but it was distinct. A sharp thud, a gasp, and then that surreal silence that happens when the world freezes around an accident. I turned, and there he was, a man collapsed in the middle of the crosswalk, his body crumpled like a ragdoll. Coffee spilled, phone skittered across the pavement, and his briefcase lay on its side. For a heartbeat, no one moved. Pedestrians froze, unsure whether to step forward or pretend nothing happened. I felt my chest tighten, adrenaline spiking. You can't just stand here, I told myself. And without thinking, I dropped my bag and sprinted toward him. Call 911, I shouted. My voice sounded foreign even to me, trembling with panic. The man wasn't breathing. His lips were pale, almost gray. Sweat glistened on his forehead, and every instinct screamed that time was slipping through our fingers. Memories of a CPR course I'd taken years ago flashed in my mind. At the time, I hadn't taken it seriously. Fake mannequins, boring instructors, but now, in real life, it all came rushing back. I tilted his head, checked his airway, and began chest compressions. 1, 2, 3. The world narrowed to the rhythm of pressing and releasing, counting and hoping. His body was rigid at first, but slowly, almost imperceptibly, it gave a small twitch. I held my breath. Around me, people were filming on their phones, whispering, and I tuned it all out. Nothing existed except his chest rising and falling under my hands. Then came the first ragged breath, a shallow gasp, but unmistakable. Relief hit me like a tidal wave, yet there was no time to celebrate. The ambulance arrived, sirens slicing through the morning chaos. Paramedics rushed over, efficiently taking control, and I stepped back, trembling, hands sticky, heart hammering like a drum. As the doors of the ambulance shut, a strange sense of familiarity pricked at me. His eyes, just for a split second, met mine. Something about them, something in the curve of his mouth, the way he blinked, made my stomach drop. A memory, a déjà vu. I couldn't place it, but it stayed with me, nagging, like an itch I couldn't scratch. I walked away, telling myself it was just adrenaline, just coincidence. And yet, the feeling didn't fade. The next hour was a haze. Coffee had long gone cold in my hand, the city moving on as if nothing had happened. But inside me, everything was buzzing. What if he didn't make it? What if my hands had failed him? But he had breathed. That ragged, miraculous gasp was proof. And yet, something about his face lingered in my mind. Familiarity I couldn't explain. By noon, I found myself wandering near the hospital he'd been taken to. I knew I shouldn't, didn't even have a reason to go, but I was drawn like a magnet. Maybe I wanted to check he was okay. Maybe I wanted answers to the weird, nagging feeling in my gut. Inside the waiting room, people sat quietly, scrolling their phones, reading magazines, or staring into nothing. The receptionist nodded at me politely as I asked for his status. "He's stable now," she said, smiling. "Do you want to see him?" My stomach turned. I had no claim to see him. "You're not family. You're just the person who happened to be there," I reminded myself. And yet, she gestured toward a door. I stepped inside, and there he was. Lying in the hospital bed, hooked to machines, tubes taped to his arms, but alive. And when he saw me, his lips curved into the faintest smile. Then he whispered, "It's you." The words froze me. "Excuse me," I asked, voice shaky. "You saved me," he said. Again. My stomach flipped. I shook my head. I don't understand. I've never met you before today." But the look in his eyes didn't waver. Sharp, clear, as though he had been waiting decades for this moment. He repeated, more insistently, 20 years ago. You don't remember. 20 years ago. I had no idea what he was talking about. My mind raced. Childhood memories surfaced, fragments of summers, lakes, schoolyards, but nothing clicked. Who are you? I asked, suddenly feeling small, like a character in someone else's story. His lips quivered, and he tried to sit up, though the tubes made it awkward. I can explain. But it's not just a coincidence that you saved me today. It's fate. And maybe, it always has been. The world tilted. I had come here expecting to see a stranger who survived because of me. Instead, I was staring at a man whose life seemed impossibly intertwined with my own. I didn't know it then, but the moment I held his chest in my hands, the first thread of a 20-year story had begun to unravel. And I was about to discover that our lives were connected in ways I never imagined. How could I have known that saving a stranger's life would uncover memories I had buried, secrets I never knew, and a destiny that refused to let us forget each other? The moment I left his hospital room, I felt a mix of relief and unease. Relief because he was alive, breathing steadily, with the faintest color returning to his lips. Unease because of the words he'd spoken. You saved me, again. 20 years ago. They played on repeat in my mind, each repetition pressing harder, demanding answers I didn't have. I wandered the sterile hallways, my footsteps echoing in the empty corridors. Nurses and staff moved efficiently, checking monitors, delivering medications, their routines unaffected by the quiet storm in my head. I tried to shake off the lingering dread, tried to convince myself that he was either confused or exaggerating. But that familiarity, the flash of recognition in his eyes, refused to leave me. Sitting in the waiting area, I dug into my own memories. Childhood summers flashed past like fragmented film. Picnics at the lake, afternoons riding bikes through sunlit streets, my parents' voices calling me inside. And then one memory hit me like a fist. A boy, struggling in the water at the lake, panic on his face, and me plunging in, dragging him to shore. Could it be? Could this man, this Daniel, as he later told me his name was, be that boy? My pulse quickened at the thought. The lake, the panic, the relief, the fear. It all came rushing back, though I had long buried the memory under years of routine, school, and work. I returned to the hospital the next day, unable to resist the pull. His condition had stabilized, and when I walked into the room, his eyes lit up, recognition unmistakable. You do remember, he said softly. I think I do, I admitted, sinking into the chair beside his bed. The lake. You were a child. I saved you there, didn't I? He nodded. Yes. 8 years old. That day changed my life. And now you've saved me again. The weight of it pressed down on me. 2 life-threatening incidents, separated by 2 decades, linked by one person who had been a complete stranger to me until this morning. How improbable was that? And yet, here we were, staring each other down in a hospital room that smelled faintly of antiseptic and fear. For a moment, we sat in silence, the machines beeping softly, punctuating our thoughts. I wanted to ask everything at once. Why today? Why now? But instead, I listened as he recounted fragmented details of his life, carefully avoiding the full story he said he needed to share later. He told me about moving away after that summer at the lake, how his family had relocated suddenly, and he had lost touch with everyone. He had never forgotten the boy who had saved him that day, me, but he had no way to reach out. And now, decades later, fate had thrown us together again under the most dire circumstances. I could see the strain in his eyes. Living through that first near-death experience had left scars, invisible to the world but unmistakable to those who knew him. He spoke of his work, his routine life, the subtle fears he had carried, fears he hadn't shared with anyone. And yet, despite his cautious demeanor, there was a quiet trust in his gaze when he looked at me. But just as I began to feel a sense of connection, he leaned closer and whispered something that made my blood run cold. There's a reason this keeps happening. Something I need to tell you. My stomach dropped. A reason? What do you mean? His voice lowered, a whisper almost swallowed by the hum of the hospital monitors. Both times, someone wanted me dead. The room tilted, poisoned, threatened. My mind raced to understand. I wanted to believe he was mistaken, that he was seeing patterns where none existed, but the intensity in his eyes told a different story. He showed me letters he had received, cryptic threats, subtle warnings that escalated over months. And now, after today's collapse, everything pointed to something sinister. I felt a shiver run down my spine. The coincidence of me being present both times suddenly seemed impossible. Maybe it was fate, or maybe it was something much darker. Then came a brief pause in our conversation, broken by the nurse entering with a medication tray. She left quickly, leaving us alone again, and he leaned back, exhausted, but still staring at me as if measuring my resolve. "You need to understand," he said, voice barely audible. "If I hadn't survived that lake when I was 8, you wouldn't be here. And if I hadn't survived today, well, you might never know why our lives are connected." The words were heavy, almost mystical, but there was a tangible edge of danger that made me sit up straighter. This was no ordinary reunion of old acquaintances. Something larger was at play, and I had been pulled in by sheer coincidence, or something more. I asked him, trembling slightly, "Who would want to hurt you?" "Why?" He hesitated, eyes darting toward the door. "It's complicated. Family business, old grudges, enemies who hold on to resentment for decades. Some things you can't run from. Some people never forget." I swallowed hard, the chill of his words sinking in. He wasn't exaggerating, and the idea that my life had intersected with his not once but twice at life or death moments made me feel like a pawn in a story I didn't understand. For the first time, I noticed subtle details around the room, a faintly open window, a shadow moving across the floor outside. My nerves prickled. Danger seemed to lurk in the margins of this story, and I was already entangled. Then he said something that froze me completely. "If you think this is over, it's only beginning. You saved me, but saving me isn't the end. Not yet." I felt my hands tighten in my lap. The idea of being caught up in something beyond ordinary life was terrifying, yet strangely compelling. My rational mind screamed to walk away, to leave him in the safety of the hospital and pretend none of this had happened. But something, maybe the bond forged in 2 life-saving moments, kept me rooted. And that night, as I left the hospital, I realized that the story was far from over. Whoever, or whatever, had orchestrated these moments had plans that neither of us fully understood. I felt a pulse of fear mixed with determination. What happens when the same hand of fate that brought you together twice might also be leading you into danger? I didn't know it yet, but the next few days would reveal secrets, threats, and truths that would test both our courage and our trust. And the first step was realizing that saving a life was only the beginning of a story far bigger than either of us could imagine. The following days were a blur of hospital visits, restless nights, and an almost obsessive need to piece together Daniel's story. Each time I entered his room, I felt like I was stepping into a parallel life, one that existed alongside mine, connected by something I couldn't yet understand. Daniel shared fragments of his past cautiously, like someone afraid of pulling a thread that could unravel everything. He described his childhood with a subtle tension, the kind that hides trauma behind smiles. He told me about moving away after that summer at the lake, about the fear of drowning he'd never fully lost, and about a vague, lingering sense that someone had always been watching him. At first, I tried to treat it as overcautious paranoia. Maybe years of childhood fear had warped his perception, or maybe I was letting my imagination run wild. But the small details he shared, letters with strange symbols, late-night phone calls with silence on the other end, subtle threats from unknown people, made my stomach twist with unease. One evening, he leaned back in his hospital bed, pale but alert, and said something that made my blood run cold. "You know, when you're a kid, danger feels distant. It's an abstract idea, but when it follows you decades later, you realize how real it can be. And how inescapable." I could almost hear the echo of that lake in his words. The panic, the helplessness, the terror of being in someone else's hands, it had followed him all these years. And now, it had come back in a new, more sinister form. Over coffee in the small hospital cafe, Daniel and I tried to make sense of the improbable coincidence that had brought us together. "I know it sounds impossible," he said, stirring his drink absently, "but someone wanted me dead that day at the lake. And today, they almost succeeded again." I blinked. "But why? You were just a child then. And today, what? A heart attack?" "No," he said softly. Not a heart attack. Poison. A slow-acting chemical. I only survived because you were there. Again. 2 near-death experiences, separated by 20 years, both prevented by you. That can't be coincidence. The weight of his words pressed down on me. It was impossible to ignore the feeling that I had stumbled into something larger than life itself. Something dangerous, and perhaps intentional. That night, lying in bed, I replayed every detail of that morning. The thud, the gasps, the way his eyes flickered with recognition. The fragments of memory from the lake. Everything lined up like a puzzle I wasn't sure I wanted to solve. I realized that if Daniel was telling the truth, I had been an unwitting participant in someone else's game for 2 decades. The next day, I returned to his room, determined to know more. He looked tired but resolute, and when I asked him to tell me the full story, he hesitated. There's more, he said, voice low, but some of it is dangerous to say aloud. I've spent years protecting myself. And now, by being here, you might be in danger too. My heart skipped. Me? Why me? Because, he said, you're connected to this. I don't know how or why yet. But you were there for me twice, and that's no accident. Whoever is behind this, they might see you as a threat now, too. I swallowed hard. The thought made my chest tighten. My life had been ordinary, mundane even, until today. Now, every shadow seemed a little too dark, every passerby a little too watchful. Over the next few days, we started piecing together the history of Daniel's family. His father had been involved in a complex web of business dealings, some lucrative, some morally questionable. Rivals had nursed grudges for decades, some of which had carried into Daniel's life. Threats had been subtle at first, letters, cryptic warnings, minor disruptions, but now they had escalated into life-threatening actions. I remember one night vividly. Daniel was asleep, hooked up to monitors, when I noticed a shadow at the window. A figure, masked, moving with deliberate stealth. My heart raced, and I grabbed a nearby chair, ready to confront whoever it was. But the figure disappeared before I could react. The next morning, Daniel looked at me with a mixture of fear and resolve. They're here, he said quietly. And they won't stop. I warned you, being close to me comes with risks. I couldn't shake the images of that masked intruder. The world I had taken for granted, quiet, predictable, safe, had dissolved overnight. And yet, despite the fear, a strange determination settled over me. Twice, I had saved his life. Twice, fate had thrown us together. Could I really walk away now? That night, as I sat in the waiting room long after visiting hours, I realized something fundamental. This wasn't just about a child saved or a man surviving a collapse. This was about a connection that transcended time, about threads in the tapestry of life pulling us together for reasons neither of us yet understood. And yet, the question lingered, why me? Why now? And who was orchestrating these near-death events? As I stared at the fluorescent lights above, I felt a chill. The next steps would be dangerous, yes, but inevitable. The truth was waiting, and someone, or something, was determined to ensure that we discovered it together. The story was far from over. In fact, it was only just beginning. And as I realized that, a single thought dominated my mind. If fate had brought us together twice, what would it demand of us next? The next morning, I returned to the hospital with a sense of determination I hadn't felt in years. Daniel's story was unfolding in pieces, each one more unbelievable than the last. Yet, there was a clarity in his eyes that made me believe him, and a tension in the air that made me realize we were both stepping into dangerous territory. He started to tell me more about his childhood, the summer at the lake, the drowning incident, and the aftermath that no one else knew about. You were a stranger then, he said, but in a way, you became a guardian I never had. And for years, I carried that memory like a shield. I listened, fascinated and uneasy. He described the fear of the water, the moment he realized he could die, and the sheer relief when I pulled him to shore. I remembered flashes of that day, though distorted and incomplete, like a dream I had forgotten. That memory, innocent and terrifying at once, now seemed to cast a shadow over both of our lives. As he spoke, a nurse entered with a clipboard, and I noticed her glancing around nervously before leaving. Something about her behavior seemed off, but before I could question it, Daniel leaned in and whispered, "They're closer than you think." Someone in this building is watching us. Be careful whom you trust. My pulse quickened. The idea of being surveilled inside the hospital added a new layer of urgency. The ordinary world I had known, streets, cafes, office buildings, had vanished. In its place was a landscape of hidden threats and unseen eyes. Determined to get answers, I suggested we leave the hospital temporarily to discuss things in a safer, more private place. Daniel hesitated, clearly weighing the risk, but eventually agreed. We moved cautiously, alert to every sound and shadow. The streets outside were deceptively calm, people going about their daily routines unaware of the storm gathering just beneath the surface. We found a small cafe tucked away from the main street, and once seated, Daniel pulled out a folder he had brought. Inside were documents, letters, and photographs, evidence of threats and harassment spanning decades. Some were mundane at first glance, misdirected mail, cryptic notes. Others were chilling. Explicit warnings, veiled threats, and photographs that suggested someone had been watching him for years. He looked at me gravely. I don't know who orchestrated today's incident, but they've been patient. Waiting for the right moment. And somehow, fate keeps placing you in the line of fire too. I felt a shiver run down my spine. This was no longer just a story of saving a stranger's life. It was a story of survival, destiny, and a shadowy force that neither of us fully understood. As we pored over the documents, I noticed a pattern. Each threat, each warning, each near-death experience coincided with moments when Daniel was vulnerable, moments when he had no one to protect him. And now, with me in the picture, the stakes had risen exponentially. A sudden noise outside the cafe made both of us look up. A figure in a dark coat had paused across the street, watching us with an intensity that sent a chill down my spine. Before I could react, the figure disappeared into the crowd, leaving us both uneasy and alert. Daniel leaned closer, voice barely above a whisper. They're testing us, watching our reactions, waiting to see what we'll do next. The realization hit me hard. This wasn't random. This wasn't coincidence. Someone, or something, was orchestrating our lives in ways I couldn't begin to comprehend. And if today was any indication, the danger was escalating. We left the cafe, walking through the narrow streets cautiously, eyes scanning for any sign of pursuit. Every shadow, every passerby, seemed to carry a potential threat. And yet, amidst the tension, a strange bond had formed between us, a bond forged through shared near-death experiences and an inexplicable connection that spanned decades. As evening fell, we returned to Daniel's apartment, determined to plan our next steps. He showed me a hidden safe containing more documents, including photographs of people from his past, some of whom had motives that remained unclear. This, he said, holding up a photograph, is someone you need to know about. They've been part of my life since childhood, quietly influencing events from behind the scenes. And now, they're involved in today's incident too. I studied the photograph, noting the sharp eyes and calculated expression. There was something familiar yet elusive about the person, as if I had seen them before but couldn't place where. The tension in the room was palpable, the weight of history pressing down on us. Then came the first true twist, a phone call from an unknown number. Daniel answered cautiously, listening intently before hanging up with a grim expression. They know we're digging, he said quietly. And they're escalating. Soon, it won't just be threats. They'll come for us directly. The words left me shaken. The story of saving a stranger's life had evolved into a complex web of danger, destiny, and secrets long buried. And as we sat in the dim light of the apartment, I realized that our next moves would be critical, not just for survival, but for uncovering the truth behind a 20-year mystery that had begun at a lake and now led us here. That night, I couldn't sleep. Thoughts of the masked figure, the documents, and the escalating threats kept me awake. I replayed every detail of my encounters with Daniel, searching for patterns, clues, anything that could prepare us for what was coming. And then I remembered a detail I had overlooked, a small, almost insignificant thing from that morning at the hospital. The way Daniel's eyes had flickered when I first saw him. The subtle recognition, the hesitation before he spoke. There was more there than just memory. Something about him, about us, had been waiting to be revealed. As dawn approached, I knew one thing for certain: our story was far from over. Danger lurked around every corner, Secrets waited to be uncovered, and the bond between us, once accidental, was now a lifeline. What awaited us next? And how deep did this web of fate and danger really go? The answers, I realized, would change both our lives forever. The next morning, the tension was palpable. Every sound felt amplified. The hum of traffic outside, the faint creak of the apartment floorboards, even the distant chatter of neighbors. Daniel and I had spent the night poring over his files, trying to trace the origins of the threats. Each lead opened new questions, each revelation deepened the mystery. "You know," he said, flipping through a stack of letters, "the people who've been after me, they're patient. They've waited 20 years for the right moment. And today, it seems, they've found it again." I leaned back in my chair, trying to process the enormity of his words. 20 years. 2 life-threatening incidents. A shadowy network of enemies that had somehow remained hidden, orchestrating events from the background. It was almost impossible to comprehend. As we reviewed photographs of faces from Daniel's past, one stood out, an older man with piercing eyes and a subtle, almost imperceptible smirk. Daniel's hand trembled slightly as he traced a finger across the image. "This is the one," he whispered. "The person behind most of the threats, the manipulations. He's clever, ruthless, and patient. And he's been watching me my entire life." I studied the photograph, feeling a chill run down my spine. There was something hauntingly familiar about him, though I couldn't place where I had seen him before. The pieces of the puzzle were starting to align, but the picture they formed was frighteningly clear. Daniel's life had been under a shadow for decades, and my involvement today had pulled me into the middle of it. Later that afternoon, we decided to take precautions. I installed temporary security cameras in the apartment, and Daniel changed routines that had become second nature over the years. Every call, every email, every interaction was scrutinized for anomalies. The stakes had risen dramatically. What had started as a life-saving act had evolved into a high-stakes game of survival. And yet, despite the danger, there was a strange sense of inevitability. Twice, fate had placed me in Daniel's path. Twice, I had saved him when no one else could. If this was destiny, then it was far from over. As evening fell, the first major confrontation arrived. A knock at the door startled me. I had been so absorbed in monitoring security feeds that I hadn't noticed the hour. Daniel's face went pale as he motioned for silence. Through the peephole, I saw a figure, tall, shadowed, deliberate. My stomach twisted. I whispered to Daniel, "Don't answer it." The figure didn't leave. Instead, a small envelope slid under the door. Heart pounding, I picked it up and opened it. Inside was a single photograph. Me, captured in a moment I didn't recognize, walking past Daniel's apartment earlier that day. On the back, in small, precise handwriting, "You're next." Daniel gasped. "They're escalating. Much faster than I thought." The next few hours were a blur of strategy and tension. We barricaded the apartment as best we could, called friends we trusted, and attempted to anticipate the next move. Each shadow seemed like a potential threat, each phone call carried the possibility of danger. I felt the weight of responsibility pressing down on me. I had saved Daniel twice, but now, that act had made me a target. There was no turning back, no hiding from the consequences of my actions. As the night deepened, Daniel recounted more from his past, details he had kept hidden for decades. Rivalries, betrayals, and calculated acts of revenge. Each story painted a picture of a life lived under constant, invisible threat. And the realization settled over me like a heavy fog. I had been drawn into this life not by choice, but by the inexorable pull of fate. Then came the twist I hadn't anticipated. A series of messages arrived on Daniel's encrypted phone, each more threatening than the last. And then, the final message. A location, coordinates pointing to a warehouse on the outskirts of the city, with a single line, "Come alone or lose everything." Daniel looked at me, eyes wide. "This is it. They want me. And if I don't go, someone else will be hurt. I have to confront them." I felt a rush of fear and determination. I couldn't let him go alone, but the risk was immense. Whoever was behind this was clever, patient, and ruthless. And now, they had drawn us into the center of a trap. We spent the night preparing, going over every detail, every possible scenario. Maps, surveillance, and emergency plans filled the small apartment. Sleep was impossible. Adrenaline and anxiety kept us alert, aware that each moment could be our last. Finally, as dawn approached, we set out. The city was quiet, deceptive in its calm. The warehouse loomed ahead, a dark silhouette against the rising sun. Every step toward it felt like walking deeper into the unknown. And then, as we approached the entrance, a shadow moved. A figure stepped into the light, revealing a familiar face, someone from Daniel's past, someone I had never met, yet whose presence made my blood run cold. "You shouldn't have come," the figure said, voice low, controlled. "But now that you're here, there's no turning back." I swallowed hard, heart hammering. The culmination of 20 years of threats, 2 life-saving moments, and the inexorable pull of fate had led us here. And I realized, with a mixture of fear and clarity, that the next few minutes would determine everything: our survival, our understanding of the past, and the unraveling of a mystery that had spanned decades. Would we survive this confrontation? And what secrets would finally be revealed? The warehouse loomed before us, dark and silent, a monument to decades of secrets, threats, and hidden agendas. Every instinct screamed to turn back, but neither Daniel nor I could retreat now. Fate had brought us to this moment, and we had no choice but to face what had haunted him for 20 years, and what had somehow entwined my life with his. We stepped cautiously inside, flashlights cutting through the shadows. Dust motes floated in the shafts of light, disturbed by our movements. The air smelled of oil, rust, and something older, something that spoke of forgotten history and lingering danger. "Stay close," Daniel whispered, and I nodded, my heart hammering. We moved through the maze of crates and machinery, every sound magnified, every shadow suspicious. The warehouse seemed endless, a labyrinth of hidden corners and unseen threats. Then, at the far end, we saw him, the man from the photographs, the orchestrator of decades of fear. He stood with arms crossed, a cold, calculating expression on his face. Behind him, monitors displayed images from hidden cameras: Daniel as a child, Daniel as a teenager, Daniel today, and me, captured in moments I hadn't realized were being watched. "You've finally arrived," he said, voice smooth and chilling. I wondered how long it would take. Daniel stepped forward, eyes blazing. Why have you spent decades trying to ruin my life? And why involve him?" He gestured toward me, my stomach tightening. The man smiled faintly. "Because it's never been just about you. It's about control, legacy, and testing the bonds people don't even know exist. You, the boy I've watched, and him, the one who saved you twice, are all pieces of the same puzzle." A puzzle. The word made something click in my mind. Everything: the lake, the near-death incidents, the inexplicable connection between Daniel and me, was part of a design. A game we hadn't known we were playing. And the man before us had been the unseen hand guiding it. "You don't understand," Daniel said, voice shaking with rage and fear. "We're not pieces in your game. We're people." The man's expression softened, almost mockingly. "Perhaps. But people follow patterns, and patterns are predictable. You were bound to intersect. You were bound to face each other again." Then came the revelation that left both of us breathless. He reached into his coat and pulled out a small box, opening it to reveal an old, faded photograph, me and Daniel as children, near the lake, smiling and unaware. "I took this the day after the lake incident," he said. "I've been watching ever since, ensuring the chain of events, testing reactions, manipulating circumstances. Every danger, every near-death moment, it was meant to see if the connection would endure." Daniel and I stared at each other, disbelief mingling with anger and fear. This man had monitored our lives for decades, controlling outcomes, testing our fates. And yet, despite the manipulation, we had survived. We had found each other again. "You've underestimated us," I said, voice steady despite the tremor in my chest. "You might have orchestrated events, but you didn't account for choice. You didn't account for courage, or loyalty, or the bond between people who truly care for one another." The man's eyes narrowed, but before he could respond, Daniel stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. "We've survived twice. That's enough to prove we're not pawns." At that moment, the tension broke. The orchestrator realized that his plan had failed. The connection he had tried to manipulate, the fear he had sought to instill, could not break the human spirit. "You think this is over?" he hissed. "There's always another thread, another test. But we didn't flinch. Together, Daniel and I turned, walking toward the exit, the warehouse suddenly feeling smaller, less imposing. The threat remained, yes, but the control he sought had been stripped away. Outside, the morning sun painted the city in warm, forgiving light. For the first time in decades, Daniel laughed, a full, genuine laugh, free from fear. And I realized something profound. Saving a life is not just about that moment of action. It's about the ripples that follow, the connections forged, the courage discovered. We stood on the street, looking at the city that had once seemed ordinary, now alive with possibilities. "We're free," Daniel said, voice soft but resolute. "At least, for now." I nodded, understanding that this story, our story, was one of fate, survival, and the inexplicable bonds that tie people together across decades. And as we walked away from the warehouse, leaving shadows and threats behind, I felt a deep sense of closure, and a spark of wonder. Who we are, who we meet, and what we choose to do in the moments that matter, can change everything. Even a stranger's life can alter the course of yours forever. And in that quiet realization, I understood why that Tuesday morning had been different, why I had stepped outside with a cup of coffee, and why fate had placed Daniel in my path. Not once, but twice. The story was over, and yet, it had changed both of us forever.